Welcome to the series Wisecracks by Dr. Gerald Mann. Dr. Mann is the senior pastor at the Riverbend Church in Austin, Texas. Let's join Dr. Mann for more of Wisecracks.
Been preaching from Proverbs, a series entitled Wisecracks, Little Windows of Wisdom into Living Well. And today we're going to look at prospering God's way. Prospering God's way. The biblical principles of success. One little proverb from 16, verse 3. Turn your plans over to God, and you will be a success. Prospering God's way. There's a man named Sir John Templeton. He is the founder of mutual funds in 1952. He's a billionaire, Christian philanthropist, gives away millions of dollars, and he's always challenging us ministers and theologians. He says, you preachers are always teaching your people the philosophy, the biblical philosophy of giving. Why don't you do something on the biblical philosophy of prospering? He says, I have two convictions. One is, you can't give it till you make it. And the other conviction I have, he says, is that you cannot give it all away if you make it God's way. He'll just keep multiplying it. And of course, most of us ministers don't want to talk about the biblical philosophy of getting because we've been so intimidated by those people who call us consumers and materialists and grubby, greedy people that we've completely ignored the Bible's philosophy of prosperity. And we've left it over to those preachers who say, if you'll give everything you have to this church, God will multiply it 100-fold. Well, I don't believe that. I will get it all if you'll let me, but there is a biblical philosophy of prosperity. I started asking myself the question, in 40 years of preaching, I have never read the Bible with that idea in mind. Is there a biblical philosophy of prospering? And by prosperity, I don't mean just things, material things. Let me say parenthetically, to prosper means to multiply the gifts that you've been given, intellectual, material, emotional, spiritual, to multiply the gifts you've been given in the environment that you've been given. Given your place and time in history to take what's been given to you and to multiply it. Prosperity is not accumulation, it's multiplication, okay? That's what I mean by prosperity. Everybody will never have the same amount of material success. To prosper means to multiply my gifts. Is there a biblical philosophy? Solomon talks about prospering quite a bit in Proverbs, in the little one we read. Turn your ambitions, literally it means to roll your ambitions over onto God, and you will prosper, you will succeed. And I thought, what does that mean? And I went back in 1 Kings and read the life of Solomon. Solomon was the most prosperous figure in all of the Bible. He was the most prosperous materially, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. What were the secrets to his prosperity? And as I reread his life story from that viewpoint, some things began to emerge that I'd never seen before. I think there are 4 factors in Solomon's prosperity, and I want to talk about them today. The first one is what I call the attitude factor. I think prosperity is, for the most part, a matter of attitude, not aptitude. I don't think people multiply and prosper because they're smarter than everybody else. I think it has to do with attitude. What kind of attitude did Solomon have? When David, his father, was on his deathbed, he calls in Solomon, and he says to him, you're the youngest of my sons, and you're going to rule. And I want to give you the basic building blocks of prosperity. 1, be confident, I can. Number 2, be determined, I will, I won't quit. Number 3, do whatever God tells you to do. Don't second guess God. Don't say, how am I going to get there? If God says go, you go. Without knowing, you go. The go before you know principle. Be confident, I can. Be determined, I will. By God, I will do what God tells me to do. Now, in recent weeks, began here in Austin, Texas, now it's spread all over America. There's been a big flap, a big controversy. One of our professors at the University of Texas, as you know, was asked by a reporter, why do people of color not score as well on achievement tests, on standard tests? And you know, the flap started and now it's grown and grown and grown. I remain quiet about that. I will remain silent no more. Somewhere in all of this argument and rhetoric, somebody needs to bring up the fact that succeeding has a lot to do with attitude. No matter what a person's color, if you are raised in an environment where you are told, here are the boundaries, and you cannot exceed those. You were born within these limits, and don't push the envelope. Every one of us will come to the boundary and say, I can't. Here's a case in point. You can go south of our border to the Latin American countries, and there are people who are born in certain classes who are told you cannot go beyond that, so they don't try. If you think you can't, you won't. You get it? My ancestors, you know where we got our names. My ancestors came from Britain, from Europe. And our name, Man, is a reflection of what my ancestors used to do. And one of my relatives has checked back into our family tree. I never wanted to know where we came from. But she's found out that the name Man, M-A-N-N, used to be M-A-N. It was British. And that we got our name because one of our ancestors was a servant, the Lord's man. In other words, his main job was emptying chamber pots. No wonder they came to this country. My ancestors were serfs for hundreds of years in Europe. And they were told, you're born a serf, you die a serf, you can't go beyond these boundaries. You are limited, predetermined. Now, anybody who grows up thinking that way will not push the boundaries. It has nothing to do with intelligence. It has nothing to do with morality. It has nothing to do with goodness. It has to do with how you think. When I was a little boy, 12 years old, a little skinny kid in the 7th grade, we had a football team that won the city championship in Houston. And we were a bunch of little pencil-neck, thin-armed kids. But we had a coach who gave us The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. I had a great honor of meeting Dr. Peale only once. And I told him this story. We were least likely to win, and we won the championship. And we had a coach who gave us that and taught us what it meant. And before every game, he would write in big letters on the chalkboard, C-A-N apostrophe T. And that was like the Energizer Bunny commercial, all us little guys sitting around there. And he would say, boys, just before the game, what are we going to do today? And we would all answer back, knock the T off a can't. And we'd go out and knock the T off a can't. Knock the T off a can't. Attitude. That's the first factor. The second factor in Solomon's prosperity was his fortitude. He had a different kind of courage. The first thing he does when he becomes king is get rid of Adonijah, his older brother, who's in cahoots with Joab, David's old hitman, the military guy, and Abiathar the priest. They're all in collusion to bring down the empire, and it's very cruel and barbaric. If you read in 1 Kings, he has a couple of them whacked and one of them exiled, and he gets rid of the demons that will infect the mission that God has called him to. Now, that's tough, but I have an idea that many of us never prosper as we were meant to because we don't have the courage to tackle the demons that we need to get rid of. Give you a case in point. I watched my father, remarkable man, brilliant, 6th grade education. His father was an alcoholic and abused him, beat him up. When he was 12 years old, he shot his own father and fled. Didn't kill him, but he bunged him up real bad. And he never went back home. And in 4 decades, I watched my father make and lose 4 fortunes. He was a genius at making money, but he could not keep it. And the reason was that he was always surrounded himself by hangers-on who would praise him constantly. It was like in order to be somebody, he had to have around him people who wouldn't produce. And I watched him go through the same destructive cycle 4 times in his life. Now, each one of us in this room has destructive cycles. And if you don't have the fortitude, the courage to deal with them, you can't prosper. If you don't have any discipline when it comes to credit, if you can't cut up credit cards once and for all, if you can't delay your gratification and wait to get what you want, if you can't live that way, you can't prosper. There are certain demons that we all have that we have to get rid of. It takes fortitude, courage, attitude, fortitude. The third principle that I see in Solomon's prosperity is what I call amplitude. I searched a long time for a word that had tude on it. What is amplitude? Well, Solomon looked at the world differently than everybody else. When he looked at the resources that were available, he saw amplitude, ample resources. He believed in what I call the philosophy of the infinite pie. He didn't believe that the pie was just so big and everybody had to fight for his piece of the pie. You remember the theme song to the Jeffersons? Moving on up to the east side, gonna have my mansion in the sky, moving on up to the east side. Finally gonna get our piece of what? The pie. The pie is only so big and everybody's got to get in there and fight for it. Now, I rigorously object to that. Solomon saw the pie as infinite. There is more there than enough for everyone. Proof of it was when he got to be king and it was time to build the temple after he had written all the poems and prospered in every way. He got ready to build the temple and he went up to the place of Tyre, a city which was the capital of the Philistines that had been their enemies for generations. And he went to King Hiram of Tyre and he said, "You have wonderful laborers, wonderful timbermen, and you have wonderful trees, and I don't have any of that. We're going to build a temple to our God, and would you come and help me build the temple, the superstructure for our temple?" And Hiram was elated because it was a heck of a contract for one thing. But he was elated that his longtime competitor had become a compadre. Do you catch? If you think success is beating everybody else rather than maximizing your own self, you're in big trouble. You will never get enough. Make compadres out of your competitors. We're not fighting over a limited resource. God's resources are unlimited. I read in the paper this morning a theologian in an Eastern seminary, and most of the guys who teach in the seminary say things like this because they don't have to raise the money to pay for the seminary. They just teach. I know that's sarcastic. I meant for it to be. He said that America's wealth is so disproportionate to the rest of the world that the reason America is great is because she's rich. I beg to disagree. America is rich because she's great. She's not great because she's rich. This is a great country because we have a place where we still depend on attitude rather than aptitude, and people through fortitude and application. There's plenty to go around. I don't believe the pie is just this big. I believe it is infinite. And so did Solomon. And he prospered. Finally, attitude, fortitude, amplitude. The factor that mainly determined, that was more significant than all the others, was altitude. Solomon reached altitude for something higher than his lowest motives. There's a passage right after he becomes king where he goes to pray and offer sacrifices to God, and he goes to sleep and he has a dream. And it's like the genie in the bottle story. God appears to him and says, "Solomon, I'll give you the one thing you want most. Tell me what you want more than anything else." I think that's where this joke came from. "And I will give it to you." And Solomon says, "I'm young, I'm immature, I have a vast empire to rule, I don't know how to do it. What I want more than anything else, my one thing, is the wisdom to rule fairly. I want to be a just king." And it's there in 1 Kings 3. God turns right around to him and says, most of the time, when I ask people what they want, they say long life, longevity, riches, loot, and the death of their enemies. I call them the 3 L's, longevity, loot, and lordship. God says that's what most people ask for. But you haven't asked for that. You've asked for the wisdom to fulfill your destiny. And because you've asked for that, I'm going to give you what you want. I'm going to give you wisdom. You will be the wisest king we've ever had and the wisest king we will ever have. But in addition to that, and I want you to hear this, as a byproduct, I'm going to give you health and wealth and power. It's a byproduct. Most of us start out in life saying we want health, wealth, and power. And those are ends in themselves. They're not. They're byproducts. Find the one thing that God wants you to do and do that with all your might, and you will succeed. Turn your plans over to God. In 1990, our church was full. It was broke. People were fighting. I started, 10 years before trying to build something here that would be a different kind of church, and we were just right on the ropes. We were about to have to declare bankruptcy, and one faithful family, who were not even members of River Bend, showed up and gave us a donation that was so large that it bailed us out. When that happened, I went away for retreat for a couple of days to decide whether I wanted to continue to pastor for the rest of my life. I realized that these people had been so faithful, the church was not moving where it ought to go. Maybe I wasn't the person for this. And if I weren't the person, I decided I was going to get out of the way and do something else for the rest of my life. And I went away to retreat, and I said, God, I want to know what you want me to do. And after much prayer, God said to me in the way He talks to me, not in a loud voice, but in my thoughts, He said, I'll give you the one thing you want most. What do you want more than anything else? And I put on my best piety. And I said, well, I just want to be the best pastor of Riverbend that you could ever have. And God said, bull. That's not what you want. Do you think you can lie to me? And I thought, well, I thought I could lie to you. Evidently, I've been doing it for years. He said, what did you... No applause, please. You've been lying to God, too, I see. It makes two of us. What do you want most? And I had to come clean. What I wanted was to be the pastor of the biggest, largest, most successful, famous, applauded church in the whole world. That's what I really wanted. And I realized that I couldn't have that because those kinds of things are byproducts. And so I had to say to God, I want to be what you want me to be, to go where you want me to go, to do what you want me to do, and to leave the success and the byproducts up to you. That's what I want to do. And I think that was probably the most honest prayer I ever prayed. I didn't say, I want to do what you want me to do. I said, I want to. And that's about as close as I could get. Now, the result of all that was that this church exploded. And people started showing up, and people started getting generous, and people started giving. And I'd like to tell you that it was because we were smart and we did things differently, but I didn't do it. I think I worked just as dumbly as I ever worked. And I waste just as many steps as I ever wasted. And I certainly don't preach as well now as I did then, I don't think. I think it has to do with the fact that all these things are byproducts. And if you'll stop chasing the byproducts and put yourself where you're supposed to be, then something marvelous can happen to you. I wrote with a book called Wisecracks, which is about to come out, which is with each of these verses. And I wrote a little rhyme for each verse. And for this verse, I wrote a rhyme which said, if you would seek that sacred place that you were meant to be, there's a surefire way to find your place and fulfill your destiny. Ask this simple question of each path before it's trod. Must I go this way alone, or can I take my God? I think that's the best thing I wrote because it speaks to me, and I think it speaks to you. Prosperity is a matter of attitude and fortitude and amplitude. Most of all, it's a matter of altitude. Are you willing to reach higher than your own selfish motives?
This concludes the series, Wisecracks. For information on other audio tapes or books by Dr. Gerald Mann, please call 1-800-388-9500 or write to Gerald Mann Ministries, P.O. Box 842076, Dallas, Texas, 75284.